just letting everybody in, doing the Zoom admin. We'll just give it a couple of minutes just to let any other people who are logging in get in. Hello. Hi everyone, I'll just get started, but as people are slowly kind of like trickling in, thanks so much for coming to Centrality of the Group event. It's going to be run by Chris Nicholson, who's just on my screen. He's to my right, but I don't know where he is on all of yours. It's nice to see all you guys. I'm Paige. I'm a project officer on CFC. Yeah, it's really nice to see everybody. Katie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, hi, it's good to see everyone. Yeah, I'm Katie, the other project officer on CFC. It's nice to see some faces.
We're basically kind of gonna let Chris do the talking today, but kind of here just if anyone has any questions, any problems, etc., just drop me or Katie an email. Just for kind of Zoom etiquette, can you, well, kind of up to Chris really, but if you're, keep yourself on mute if you've got any big noises going on behind, because otherwise it picks it up. And we will kind of do a bit of a CFC update towards the end of the session to talk a bit more about the annual forum, which is happening next month. But we'll tell you a bit more about that after Chris's talk. So yeah, over to you, Chris.
Okay, I'm just turning off emails so we don't get a regular beep in the session. So nice to see everyone. Thanks for coming along. I can see some familiar faces here and some people I don't think I know, but it's nice to have a group growing. Maybe it's going to keep growing. I see people are going to be coming in. And it's a slightly odd one to be talking about groups in a large sort of online group, really. It doesn't feel right to me in some way. I prefer to be in a room with you together. But it's quite interesting because online things have been going quite well. I've been running groups and even have run a group relations conference with colleagues. And it's very surprising how much people can feel connected, strangely, even though we're often in different countries and in very different kinds of locations together, but in our own rooms at home. And that's quite interesting. Something about the power of our imagination and our capacity to connect with each other through technology is quite remarkable. But I try to give you an opportunity to be involved in this a little bit later with some questions, and depending on time we might do some small groups so that you have a chance to talk about today what you're learning together in smaller groups. So this is something called the centrality of groups. That was the title that Paige and Katie gave to this event, the centrality of groups, and that's because people in the community of communities from different communities and different services were asking really for some training about groups. So this will be that sort of a training, and it's not going to be overly theoretical. There are some ideas here, but it's not going to be overly theoretical. What I'm imagining is needed is something a bit more practical. And thinking about the purpose of groups, what groups are for, why we run groups, that sort of thing. So I'm going to talk about groups in a very general way. And some of you who I can see here, some of these ideas will be familiar because I've worked with you before, and maybe for others some of these things will be new. And hopefully we'll get to a point where we can discuss them together a little bit later. So I'll share my screen. I believe that Paige and Katie are recording this event, so just so that you're aware of that. For me, it's nicer if I can see you, and if you're visible on the screen. Some of you might not want to be visible now that it's recording. I mean, you look at me, you see, I never worry. I just look a bit of a mess. I'm going to press on. But it is recorded, so you're going to know that it's recorded. It's going to be informal and friendly. And if you want to ask questions, for a start, put those in the chat. You can put some questions in the chat, so do use that. If you've got comments you want to make, put those in the chat too. If you're desperate to ask a question and not sort of lose the moment where the question is relevant, then please unmute yourself and interrupt, and I'll try to deal with your question there and then. And that can sometimes be quite good because it feels a bit more live. So let's do that as well. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now, and let's see how that goes. Okay. Right. Okay, so the centrality of groups. I'm going to give this a bit of a subtitle, really, and that is groups and how to survive them. Groups are complicated, and I would say, by way of summary, that the purpose of groups is to lose yourself and to find yourself. And that is why groups are so difficult, really, because in a group we do feel that we lose ourselves. We can often feel the pressure of the other members of the group. We feel somewhat odd going into a group. It's not the same as being with a couple or even 3 people. As soon as you enter a group, particularly if it's more than sort of 3 or 4 people, something else begins to emerge in the way in which we interact, and it's quite interesting to wonder what that was. And lots of writers and theorists, particularly psychoanalysts, have considered, what it is that makes us feel so different. But in some ways, we do lose ourselves a bit. We find that we behave differently and we feel differently. Sometimes we surprise ourselves with our behavior in groups. Sometimes we're quite surprised that we might be very quiet, or we might talk too much, or we might become nervous or anxious and not know why. It's the finding yourself in groups which I think is really important. And if you're going to run groups and you're going to be a group presenter or a group facilitator or a group convener, or just a group worker, working with colleagues, it's finding yourself that you need to be able to do, to find your voice and to find your capacity to work within a group and be confident within a group as far as you can, to use the available resources which groups have to offer. And I'm going to be talking about what those resources are. So just so that you're aware, my name's Chris Nicholson, and I've worked in several therapeutic communities in my past, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Both of them in Essex. They were for traumatized boys and girls in Essex, adolescents generally. I now work at the University of Essex. I'm involved with the consortium of therapeutic communities, and I tend to do anything that the community of communities ask me to do. I don't know why. I'm fond of them, I suppose. And I do some other bits and pieces, some training and supervision in various places, principally in the UK, but in other places as well. I'm genuinely interested in groups and group life. That's something that I just feel quite interested about. And a lot of our learning, I think it's true to say that a lot of the learning that we do socially and we do in groups. So today I'm going to cover just a few ideas, why we run groups, a little bit about how to run groups. Some of that will be practical. I want to talk about the community meeting, because many therapeutic communities use a community meeting as a particular resource for their work. And then I want to have a discussion with you about what skills we need in groups. And I've got some ideas about that, but I want to hear some of your ideas as well. And that might be the point at which we enter into small groups. But we'll see how we go for time. Okay, so why run groups and how to run groups? These are the first things I'm going to cover. The social work lecturer at the Tavistock, Adrian Ward, said the group is the greatest resource in any group care setting. It's often underused because people do not fully recognise its strengths or know how to harness them. And I think that not knowing about the strengths of groups and how to harness them is really what we're aiming to talk a little bit about today. I'm going to use, to start with, a very nice book, not Psychodynamic, by Geldard and Geldard, a husband and wife writers who write about groups. And I'm just going to draw some basic ideas. They're talking about children's groups, and we're thinking about groups in general. So human beings have lived in groups for pretty much all of their history. And it's true to say that quite often people that are more solitary, loners, are seen as slightly odd, and often they seem threatening to a group. You know, a group sees a person on its own, and it can often feel that person on their own is a little bit odd. If you go into a bar or a restaurant on your own, it can sometimes seem a bit odd. Actually, I think solitary life and spending time alone is just as important as groups, and the fact that the two should intermingle. If you spend all your time in groups, you can lose yourself in a very thorough way, and some time alone to reflect and think about group life is also really important. Many of the problems that emerge in our lives emerge in group settings, in our work, in our families, and therefore groups become an extraordinarily good resource for addressing those same problems. It's a little bit like a vaccination. You know, you have a vaccination and you're given a bit of something which is problematic. The thing that you're given, it makes you ill, and then you develop antibodies. And to that extent, group life, to use groups therapeutically, enables you to develop sort of antibodies that accustom you to group life and give you the skills and capacities that you need to survive within group life, whether it be the intimate setting of a family or a work setting or a social setting. And groups are typical. You know, groups throughout our history have occurred in many different places. Storytelling groups, encounter groups, before therapeutic groups. This is a natural form of human life. Sometimes, perhaps, people do need therapy, but they can't manage to have the intimacy of one-to-one therapy. And that intimacy leads people to feel overwhelmed and to drop out, maybe not carry on with their therapeutic work. With children, some parents are rather threatened by the idea of the therapist and the child forming a close relationship. It's almost as though they feel they're going to lose the parental authority. So that can be a problem for parents. And in both of these instances, group work might be the solution. But group work is incredibly difficult. And to make group work well, you need to have workers, people that are doing the work, facilitating or convening the groups, who are very confident in the efficacy or the usefulness of groups. If you're doubtful about how groups can work as a therapeutic tool, then you're not really going to be the best group worker. It really does take a degree of confidence in your own capacities and the capacities of your colleagues. So let's have a look at some of the advantages of group life. So members in groups can learn to tolerate different kinds of attitudes and behaviours in groups, and they learn to do this by observing others, reflecting a bit on themselves, seeing how other people behave, and within the setting of the group, with the facilitation of a group worker, this atmosphere can be just about held in a manageable way. It doesn't overwhelm the individual, and that capacity to increase toleration of difference, of emotion that's stirred up in groups can be very, very helpful. By watching other people, you can develop new skills, new internal capacities, I mean emotional and psychological capacities, and you can learn from these, from the other members of the group and from the group facilitators about different ways of seeing the world, and these can be reinforced. For vulnerable people, I think learning to look after yourself, not place yourself at risk, is a really important skill that can be developed in groups. And on a simply economical level, you know, groups are cost effective. You know, you can work with a large number of people in one go, and yeah, that's really important. There are places in the world where people can't really afford to be involved in groups at a larger level, and coming into a small group setting would be very cost effective. Rather than going into individual forms of treatment, you know, in areas in the third world, for example, groups would be a really good resource. So groups promote change. As children, we do a lot of our learning in groups. We do it instinctively, intuitively, before we really gain through language and cognitive skills. We're picking up a lot in groups. And it's obvious that we don't want the members of staff to outnumber children or adults in a group. The groups need to have a quality of being benign, and that means that the members of the group need to really feel that they have a place in that group. And the reinforcement is powerful if it comes from the other members of the group. And so by having this group reinforcement, which the facilitator can endorse and can support, groups become very powerful modes of changing behavior and changing attitudes. They're a major source of feedback, and a capacity really to see yourself more objectively in a group somehow. You know, you see the problems that you have embodied by other people. So you see somebody who has a difficulty, for example, with putting other people down. Perhaps they feel themselves inadequate, and what they tend to do is, because they feel inadequate, they tend to make other people feel inadequate. You see, now they can observe that behavior in a member of the group and sort of see what it's like to be on be the recipient of that sort of a behavior, to see how that other person operates and begin to see the pros and cons of their behavior. Is it working for them that they keep being rude to other members of the group and upsetting people? And it's like their problem but seen in somebody else, so it can be objective. And that capacity to externalize our own difficulties that you can do within a group is very important, and that enables you to learn something, and you can give feedback to that person in the group. Of course, when you give feedback to that person, you're sort of telling yourself something important about your own behavior at the same time. Groups parallel the wider social environments, and that's one of the fundamental things. We're working in a group and we're in the group, but really that group in some way is related to the external world. And you might say it's a sort of practice environment. We want to develop skills and capacities within this small group so that we can take them beyond the group into our ordinary lives. And the group itself stimulates a sense in which the problems from the external world emerge within the group. So it's a place where you can use trial and error safely, without maybe risking so much as you might do if you were trying out a new behavior or a new way of speaking, for example, with your parents. If you're a child or a young person, that might be quite dangerous, but to try it out in the group can be something manageable. And groups can obviously look at problematic behavior. which might be expressed, and that can become manageable in a group. Members get support in trying new skills. They might receive support from members of the group who praise them for behaving in a different way, perhaps a new way, a way that they've never tried before. And this enables the person to see that, yeah, you know, this new skill, this new way of being who I am, this new form of their identity is acceptable, and it actually works. And that can help reinforce those feelings and those thoughts about group work, and enable them to become sustained parts of the identity of that person, rather than just things that they're trying out in a superficial way. The most obvious thing really about groups is that they create a sense of belonging. You can form attachments both not only to the group leader and the facilitator, but also to all the other members of the group. And you can form that attachment on the basis of a number of different factors. If you go through difficult experiences with people, you often feel bonded to them, don't you? And groups will be challenging and difficult. But surviving those experiences in the setting of a group is actually something that enables you to bond with other members. It's not just that it's positive and it's warm, it may also be challenging and difficult, but you're learning something together, and that feels very important. It can develop a sense of being interdependent, interconnected. You rely upon the other members of the group. It may be that you need to rely upon other members, but you've never really been very good at doing that. You've been aloof and independent in your life. And the capacity to learn to depend upon others is also very important. For some people, it might be the first time they're accepted within a group and validated, a sense of being confirmed in themselves. And that can be very new and a very powerful new experience. The belief that people have sometimes that they don't fit in the world, that they're marginalized, and the tendency actually to marginalize themselves can be worked with and let's say gently challenged within a group setting. You know, you can reinforce perhaps a new sense of who that person is, which will be quite different from their own self-belief. In groups, common needs can be addressed, and that's most obvious if you imagine a group, for example, for young women who are depressed, or for men who drink too much, something of that kind. So there are common needs that can be addressed simultaneously. And in addressing this common theme that everybody in the group shares, the members come to feel less isolated and come to feel that they're able to support each other. There are limitations to group work, and that has to be faced. Group work is extraordinarily difficult. And you can imagine some individuals might not fit so well into group settings. Now, I tend to think that groups, if they're well planned, can work with pretty much any characteristic problem or any mental health difficulty or any form of difficult behavior. But I just want to note some of these potential limitations. People who lack impulse control can be quite destructive in groups, and it can be very difficult to manage them because the group doesn't reach a sense of stability. People who can be aggressive in groups tend to be quite emotionally detached. In other words, less available for listening and to others in the group. That can be quite difficult. Volatile, violent behavior can be extraordinarily difficult to manage in the group because it can lead you to having to intervene physically to keep people safe. In children's groups, the kind of children that I work with, very, very volatile young people. We've run groups, but actually sometimes it does mean that the child becomes very angry and tries to hurt somebody else in the group, and they have to be held or even escorted from the room. That's quite difficult. Some young people might be at different developmental ages, and mixing people at different developmental ages in groups can be tricky at times. If people have very severe psychiatric disorders, they may struggle to be in groups and feel that they're becoming somewhat lost, or they tend to not so much act out always those mental health difficulties, but under express themselves and feel somewhat lost and isolated. And that can exacerbate some of the more severe psychiatric problems. And people that have expressive language issues, in other words, they're receptive, the capacity to understand what's being said by others in groups, they can feel very much at a disadvantage in a group setting, because they may seem and look perfectly able to cope, but actually if they're not understanding what's being said, if they're not picking up on subtle nuances in behavior and in body language in groups, they are very much at a disadvantage. And for people of these kinds, groups which are purely for people that have these kinds of issues and difficulties are better, rather than them being mixed with groups that have different characteristics and different modes of communication. Now, I'm saying that all in a slightly vague way, because I do believe if you plan groups well, you can accommodate most types of groups. Groups do need very good resources, and there's a physical environment that needs to be suitable to run a group. And I've seen people trying to run groups in the most unsuitable environments, full of different equipment and activities, or noise or light that's too much. And this really doesn't help. In a way, it's better to have a space which is almost built for the purpose of running groups. You need good activities and resources if you're running groups, particularly if you're going to run groups with children, where you need a balance of reflection and activity. And the most important thing is a very robust human resource. Group workers need to be well trained. They need to share a model and a sense of working together. They need to be emotionally tolerant. They need to be self-contained, have a capacity to manage themselves even when they're being stirred up emotionally by members of the group. And they need to be extremely well prepared for the likely behaviors and communications that will come up in the group by the members. And all of this really needs to be prepared for. There's a sort of psychological labor that goes into group work. And if you don't go through that labor, let's say you have a bad birth, that will not go well. So that's really important. A final thing about groups is that they're generalizable, that you transfer the learning beyond the group. This is really important, that you're seeing the group as a place where you practice skills that can then be used elsewhere in different settings. I sort of said it before, but that word generalizability is really important. And in a way, you want to stress that that people in the group are learning something to practice it and to try it elsewhere. It's not purely for the purpose of being in a group. If you're running a therapeutic group and you just keep coming back to the group and you never use those skills and abilities elsewhere, then that's not gonna be very helpful. Groups are extraordinarily evocative. A colleague of mine, Kedar Dwivedi, is an Indian psychiatrist, said interactions in the group and working on different participants' issues in the group trigger perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors that in day-to-day life have proved pathological. So what he's really saying is that groups activate the very things that in our normal lives are problematic. You can say pathological, you can say disturbing, you can say troubling, but if you have specific issues with overreacting to individuals, if you're not able to wait, if you're frightened of criticism, if you see all males as authority figures, then those kinds of fears will be activated in a group, and the tendency will be that you act them out in the group. Yeah. So groups are necessarily evocative. They are not places where people sit calmly and quietly, unless it's a sort of meditation group, perhaps. Generally speaking, groups that are aiming to do work are purposefully evocative spaces, and they're full of evocative and disparate and difficult to get a hold of amorphous emotions, which can be quite bewildering and difficult to manage. Now, I want to emphasize two kinds of groups which can often be forgotten. One is a primary group, and this group is, I think, full of potential for therapeutic function. But I'm going to define the secondary group first, because secondary groups are really devices for doing something practical. So in a way, we might say that, today is, at the moment, is a bit of a secondary group, because you're all here because you all want to learn something about groups. But if we were together in a room, I might be doing this training a little bit differently. I might be utilizing the fact that we can all see each other and we can even perhaps be in a circle. I might be using the group in a very different way, not as a device for conveying some ideas to you, but really to think about what potential there might be in the group that we represent today to think about some of these topics together. And that would be a primary group, because I would be using the very resources that emerging groups to deliver the training. Whereas today I'm sort of talking to you and using a PowerPoint, and that's more like a device, you see. So what we're thinking about is how we can use groups in this primary way. It's the groupishness that we're trying to use. That's the resource, not just a collection of people, but the fact that it becomes a group. And that is a thing in itself that we're trying to really utilize. Alongside that, it's another way of thinking about two elements of a group, really, is the notion of an indigenous peer culture and a therapeutic culture. And the indigenous peer culture is a culture that exists within any group. So if I think about traumatized adolescents, then their indigenous peer culture is quite abrasive. It's more like a gang, really, than a group. It blocks out workers. It huddles together. It is often quite violent and volatile. It is unstructured. It is abusive, self-abusive quite often. It is suspicious and untrustworthy. It's all of those kinds of characteristics. But that is the culture that exists in those groups. Now, how do you move that culture toward a therapeutic culture? How do you shift the culture of that group? Because it's a therapeutic culture that you want, but that's not going to exist from the beginning. Groups will be more indigenous and defended when you begin them. And only over time can you move toward a therapeutic culture of the group. So I'm just showing you now an image of what's quite clearly a gang. And you see the way that people stand, you see the defensiveness of their body language, the fact that they're exposing, let's say, the vulnerable parts of themselves, their face, where their sensitivities and their fears might be available. So that's very much a gang. But show you a different image of a group of men, maybe a similar age together, and you see the shape of these men, the way that they're soft in their shapes, the way that they're in contact in a different way, the openness of their postures and their eyes and the way that they're looking. So they're a group of men. Of course, they're in a photograph, but you get the feeling that this is not too much of a posed photograph. This is an alive moment, and you see that in the expressions. So I would call this a group. This is a group. This is not a gang. And there's something about the inner world of these men, which is in contrast to the inner world of the men you saw in the picture before. In other words, there's something of a very defended inner world going on in the men in the previous image, and the people in this image seem to have an outgoing quality. They're open to the world around them. They're not suspicious. I'm trying desperately not to use any terminology here, but I might be saying that this is a group of people who are have reached a depressive position. They're very available to be in a relationship with you. The people in the previous group are perhaps a bit more in a paranoid schizoid position. They're a bit shut off. They're extremely aggressive and somewhat suspicious, liable to project all kinds of notions and ideas into you if you were to try to communicate with them. Okay, so I'm thinking primarily about a psychoanalytic group. Maybe you're not thinking about a psychoanalytic group quite so much, but I'm imagining that most therapeutic communities, somewhere in the frame of the community, have something of at least a psychodynamic approach. And the purpose of a psychodynamic or psychoanalytic group is clearly to bring the unconscious into consciousness, to draw out the motivations and the concerns which are hidden often in the individuals and hidden in the group out into the open, so that they can be thought about, talked about, and perhaps more choices can emerge in terms of how members use their capacities and their characteristics. And the treatment in these groups is really based upon drawing out the sort of symptoms, you might say the difficulties that the individuals are facing. And underneath those symptoms or difficulties, there'll be some causal issues around perhaps early experience or adversity that also need to emerge and be considered. But in a way, we want to start with thinking about what are the obvious problems, which I'm going to call in this case symptoms, that might be underlying, and they will be evoked and they will emerge in a group setting. In groups, we're really working in the here and now. You know, of course the past exists, but there's something about working in the here and now. This is a live encounter within a group setting. And the notion of sort of psychoanalytic interpretation is not always very helpful. In fact, it's not very helpful working one-to-one sometimes. Intellectual insight into what's going on in the group is not always going to create change in the group. It's not about interpretations necessarily. It might be about taking up a new style or a new approach to what's happening in the group at the time. So if the group is struggling with something, let's say on this particular occasion, people in the group are talking about trivial issues and they're not talking about the purpose of the group. Could be to do with eating disorders or addictions or some element of mental health difficulty, and they're avoiding this, they're just not talking about it. Then, you know, there's an opportunity to think about what the transference in the group might be. What are the issues that are being brought from the outside into this group, from the past into this group, which might be being acted out live? And the purpose is not to talk about the past, but to imagine what might be emerging from the participants' difficulties in this live setting now, in the here and now, and speak to that, name the issue, name what's happening in the group now, and that's how you approach the work. One of the really important things in running groups, I'm going to mention a number of them, is the fact that you're trying to encounter these volatile emotions and difficult experiences that the group members have encountered, but you're trying to do that in a way which is manageable. And then I suggest what you need to do is to provide what's called soothing interjects. When I say interjects, that is a bit of an odd term, but it's something you can take in deeply into yourself. You know, we take things in from other people. We take things in, not only food and drink, we also take in other people's moods. We take in their praise of us, their words. We take these inside in some way. And some of those things are difficult to take. And we say, when somebody says something hard to us, we say, we can't stomach that, or we can't even stomach that person. It's as though we've taken them inside. And here, I want the idea to get across that we need to give in a group something soothing for the members, so that they're able to manage, and in a sense, a balance between soothing things and difficult things will be what groups consist of. So the facilitators of a group are auxiliary ego and superego provisions. In other words, there are capacities that you have as group leaders and group workers, which the members, this is why they're members, perhaps don't have. They may not have a capacity to wait. They may not have a great capacity to think about their difficulties. They tend to be more reactive. And you provide both a capacity to think on their behalf and to register emotion on their behalf, but also to give something good to them that enables them to stay in the group and to manage the group when it's most challenging. So in a very simple way, and I'm not imagining, obviously, some of the things I'm going to say might not be appropriate in every single group, but I'm imagining groups in which there might be refreshment provided at certain points in the time frame of that group, within a very, very set structure. There might be a balance between activities, doing things, and reflecting on the issues that are emerging within the group. You can't have groups where you're just reflecting and dealing with difficult stuff all the time. It's just too much for people to manage. There may need to be a balance between challenging behavior and attitude and supporting people in the group. And those two things are in tension, but they both have to be present. It may be very important that the group is alive to the realities of people's lives, and you celebrate birthdays and Christmas and holidays, and all of those elements are celebrated and noted within the groups, because they're so important in people's lives. And in a way, they give you a little bit of relief from the difficulties inherent within group life. Issues around joining and leaving are also incredibly important, and they can be celebratory, and they can be areas where giving something good to those people emerging and those people that are leaving is very important. And there are different ways of doing that, different kinds of practices. These kinds of practices need to have a kind of ceremonious sort of quality. In other words, they're routine, they're regular. You always do it like this in this group. And that enables people to feel safe. They recognize that when they join, something happens all the time in a joining. It's a similar sort of experience. When people leave, then in this group, leavings are marked in this way, however it might be. If you give somebody a certificate, or if you have a round of applause, or if everybody in the group says something important about that person and their relationship to them. But the fact that it's regular and it's a routine experience gives people in the group a feeling of safety and a feeling of belonging to something which is special. So I want to say a little bit now about the community meeting. This is a very strange thing, the community meeting. It happens in different groups in different ways, and in a way, to define it is a bit odd, because all of the communities will run a community meeting in a slightly different way. But the point of including it is to recognize that the community meeting is a form of group work. It is a therapeutic intervention in the settings in which you work. It's not an arbitrary thing. It fits into group work. So my way of describing this then is to say that the community meeting is the key place where all members of the group or the community, that's staff and young people or adults, depending on your community, come together to understand and to resolve whatever difficulties and conflicts may arise, whether for individuals, the group, or the community as a whole. It's quite useful to think of those three levels: the individuals, the group, and the community as a whole, because not all the members of the community will necessarily be in every community meeting. So you've got these three levels, and at each of those levels, problems can emerge, and they can be addressed within the community meeting. So there are a number of components to community meetings, and I'm going to run through them. The first one is that this is a space for holding and containment. That's a Winnicottian and a Bionian term, holding and containment. Members can feel safe to speak out, they can take risks, they can watch and learn from other people in the group. And that's a very important factor of a community meeting, just to be a place to hold people and allow them to communicate their concerns. It is a basic space, really, to give information, talk about who's going to be visiting the community or the group, to talk about important meetings that are coming up for young people or adults, for planning of events in the future, practical things that can all be discussed within the context of group life. And it's also a setting to democratically, working with the people in the group, establish some sense of rules or boundaries which everyone can then participate in. And those rules and boundaries will have much more grounding in the work of the community if they've been co-created with all the members. Other components of the community meeting are and I think this is one of the most important, actually, the one I'm going to mention now, are to acknowledge events from home or from the past which still impact upon the members of the group, upon their capacity to manage life in the here and now. So, as I said, this is a place where issues from the past and from the internal world get imported into the group life. And it's really important that these are named and these are discussed, and they're not ignored or put to the side or trivialized, but they really are dealt with within the context of that meeting. They might get dealt with by thinking about the kind of incidents and conflicts that emerge within the community. That's not the only way to deal with it. It doesn't have to wait until things get so bad that there are conflicts and those kinds of issues. But that's one of the ways in which they can be dealt with. And it's important that all the members of the community see the staff and the facilitators and other members addressing conflicts and these kinds of issues, because these issues will impact upon the ordinary running of the community. They get in the way, they make people late for appointments, they spoil an educational activity or a leisure activity, and therefore whatever happens, they must be brought into the next available meeting to be thought about and to be resolved. And that's so important that nothing goes underground. Finally, and I mentioned this earlier, the celebration and praise of any kind. This is where you're giving something good to the members. If it's an achievement, if it's something that somebody's done for the first time, a new role that they've taken on in the community, they take up the role of, I don't know, somebody who helps it with taking the minutes of the community meeting, or they take on the activity of doing some new chores, something of that kind. Maybe they go on an activity on their own for the first time, and these things really need a good deal of praise and a good deal of fuss made over them, because they're desperately important for the person that's doing this for the first time. Now, regarding what skills we need, this is something I want to talk with you a bit more generally about, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a few minutes at this stage. So let's just see where we are. If there are questions in the group that are here now, I see we've got about 33 or so people here. So are there questions and comments so far you want to pick up about any of the things that I've said about groups? It'd be great to hear that now and maybe begin a bit of a discussion.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you can.
Hello, okay. Sorry, our connection is a bit unstable.
Okay. If you can't ask the question, we can't hear you, could put it into the chat for us and we can see if we can take it up there. So let's see if you can put your question in the chat.
The question in the chat.
Okay. I think you've come back. Yeah, I was wondering, regarding the celebration and acknowledgement, do you think there could be a risk of people not receiving that acknowledgement in comparison to others? So creating a sort of rivalry, possibly.
Well, it's true to say that members of the group might respond to the experience of other people being praised or other people having attention in a very sensitive way. And it may be, even if you're extraordinarily careful about ensuring that everybody receives praise for their achievements, it's going to be received by individuals very differently because of their internal world, because of their different ways of seeing the world and their experience. And so someone might feel terribly upset and terribly anxious that they've been ignored. But the fact will be that you haven't ignored them. This is a perceptual issue. And then you need to work with that anxiety or that hurt, that sensitivity that an individual has it needs to be challenged in a very gentle way and tested in reality. You might say, well, look, we recorded it in the minutes from the community meeting 5 weeks ago that we talked about the wonderful thing that you did when you went on a day's work experience for the first time, you know. And so that you need to bring in the memory of the group to help that person see that their account of the experience is rather idiosyncratic. It's rather their own perception. Of course, you must be very careful to ensure that you are fair and that you are paying attention to all of your members. And if you're not, if you discover that you've actually made an error and in some way you have neglected an individual, then it's really important to acknowledge that and to think about why that happened and how that happened.
Yeah, thank you. That's very explanatory.
Okay. Well, just to ask you, where are you talking to us from?
From London.
From London. Okay. Okay. Great. Okay.
Yeah.
So, are there any other questions about some of the elements of group work that I've touched on so far? We didn't touch upon silence, but obviously when you ask the questions, it can go a bit silent. Silence is very important in groups. I have this term that I like to use of a working silence. It's a good silence. It's a silence in which people are thinking, in which people are processing issues that have emerged in the group. And then there are other kinds of silence which have a different quality, and you have to use your emotional sensitivity to pick up on the kind of silence. But I'm hoping today your silence is a working silence and you're thinking of questions you might want to ask, but I'm very open to hearing them. Jessica, you've got a question.
Hi, I was wondering if you could give some advice about how to transfer or how to modify an Indigenous peer culture that might be quite, I don't know, disruptive and difficult into a more therapeutic culture where you can start actually to work with the people rather than being fighting against. An advice on that term.
Yes. Well, it's very difficult depending on what kind of culture that is and what kind of group it is. If you're talking about children, it's a lot harder in some respects. Yeah, you're talking about children's groups, eh? Yeah, well, I understand very readily what that's like.
Yes, actually.
Okay, yeah. The thing about children's groups, maybe it's true of all groups to some extent, but much more with children, is children pull you into their Indigenous culture. And you'll find that if you have members of staff who have elements of their own personal development that perhaps is not quite finished, in other words, they're very vulnerable to the adolescent within, let's say, then they can be pulled into the adolescent culture of the group. And they begin to equalize, they begin to see themselves almost as peers with the young people. Now, of course, we might say that everybody's equal, but adults and children are different. So they're not equal in they're equal in terms of their worth, but they're not equal in this respect, because the adults are adults and the children are children. So there's something about acknowledging the tendency to be pulled into the psychological collusions, which has to be borne in mind and brought into training for staff so they're aware of it. If they're not prepared for it, it's likely to happen. And it's likely to happen even when they are prepared for it, actually. But it's good if they know intellectually this is a feature of group life. So there's something about having a really good shared practice in the staff team, which is important. There's something about ensuring that the practice of groups is very standardized for this particular group of young people. So the groups are very well structured. They're the same time each week. They start at the same time, end on the same time. You follow a standard structure that the children can learn to trust in, because they're going to be extraordinarily frightened in groups. The groups will provoke all of their fears and defenses, and this can lead to violent acting out. It can lead to avoidance of the group, and these things are really difficult. I mentioned about giving soothing interjects before. I said about, maybe snacks at a certain point, maybe regular periods where you say very nice things to the group, or there are fun activities which happen within the process of the group activities, something nice that they can enjoy. And that can, so that the tension in the group doesn't build to the point where it becomes overwhelming, and then the Indigenous culture kind of breaks out and takes over. So there are some of the things you can do to avoid that. But a part of it actually is for the adults within the group to be alongside those young people and to tolerate the kind of culture that they create and not to be rejecting, which is very, very hard, because even when you challenge bad behavior, you challenge behavior like swearing, actually it can come across very punitively and it can separate you from the children. So there's something about challenging it, but in a very light way, almost a humorous way. And the young people gradually will step into a space that the staff allow for a relationship. But if you become so hooked up on managing and controlling the children, you can never get close enough to them to make a connection. So it's an emotional connection that your staff need to make with the young people that will allow them to begin to bring the therapeutic culture with them into the children's group.
I was going to ask, can I ask a question? It's Tara.
Tara, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say to you around the 3 R's and just the regulating and the relationship and the reasoning, and you've kind of touched on it there. Like a lot of our children, sometimes I find that you can go into the reasoning with them in community meetings when they're not at that stage yet.
Yes.
So you can use the community meetings as kind of a talking shop of like, oh, this behavior that you did was really bad, and let's talk about why you hit another child and what was going on there. And they're not in that, they're not able to reason, they're not at that stage yet. So I suppose it's even kind of like trying to pare it all back to kind of the regulating, the co-regulation,
Well, the co-regulation, if you're talking about state regulation, sort of emotional regulation, so that comes when you have fun, when you do things together that you can enjoy each other's company.
Yeah.
And those activities, they're not always going to be in the group. They might be having a game of football or going on a boat or something, some activity. But those activities are really important, where you can get a bit closer and form those relationships, and then you take that bond that you create into the meeting. Sometimes actually you have to, when you're not in the meeting, it's good if the staff can refer to the meeting. It's like you're having a good time. You say, well, look, we're having a really good time together. How come when we're in the meeting you can be so aggressive? It's because we're having a really great time now, and the meeting's just another part of the day. Now, how come, or you have to do some individual one-to-one work. So it might be the key worker working with that child does some work on the issue, and then they help the child to bring the issue into the meeting. So in a sense, you're preparing the young person to be in the group, because being in those groups are really threatening. Being in peer groups at school.
If there's an issue to be resolved, particularly if there's an issue to be resolved.
Particularly if there's an issue to be resolved. Yeah. So I'm suggesting some preparatory work goes on before the group.
Yeah.
To enable the young person to come into the group, and it is extraordinarily difficult. But it doesn't mean to say, however difficult it is for the children to hear, it's still important that for the community, whatever that issue is still raised in the group, even if the child is not going to be. So you can have a conversation about a person's behavior and their conduct without challenging them in the group. You can say, well, we're not going to challenge you, but we're going to talk about it, because they're not yet at the stage where they can use the group, and you want to keep them in the group. And then a later stage will be engaging with them directly about their behavior. Yeah, it's very difficult, because your colleagues maybe, and some of the members of the community, they feel upset by something that a young person or an adult has done that's been destructive, and they want to challenge it, and they're full up with emotion. So as much as anything, the job for you is to prepare your staff team before the group to really contain and manage their own feelings about what's happened. Say, for example, in children's groups, that a member of staff might get hurt. They might get kicked or hit or spat at, and it's very upsetting. And of course, their colleagues feel protective, so they come into the group feeling somewhat aggressive. So you have to do some work before the group to process those emotions, so that the staff team are able to act effectively in the group. Because if they can't manage their emotions in the group, how on earth can you possibly expect children to, who are taking you as their role models?
I like kind of what you were saying about the structuring kind of, and having maybe a snack. So if you're resolving an issue and then you're almost breaking it with a snack and then moving on to, okay, you know, what achievement somebody did this week. So it nearly changes the tempo.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's certainly, you want, let's say moments of transition from one state into another, you know, so otherwise, you know, the whole group feels like it's contaminated. But to have little moments, and if they're regular, the children will get used to them. It's like, you know, if I ask you to hold your breath, there's only so long you can hold your breath. You're going to have to breathe, you know, and children are only going to be able to hold their emotional breath for so long. And then they need to let out, and they're taking something new. And at those points, sort of punctuation marks in group life, you need to help them realize that they only have to last until this point, and then something else will happen. You know, never allow group meetings with adolescents or children to go on for longer than they should. They'll never trust you if you let that happen. You've got to end when you're going to end. And that, you know, these things are very important because you're trying to build really a contract with your group members. And if you break the contract, you're breaking the trust, you're breaking the relationship. In a way, you're doing what other people have done to them in their past.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
I saw Rob Price has got his hand up. Are you there, Rob?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, we've been sort of running community meetings here with the young people. Initially, didn't have much success at all, but it has become more successful than not. And it's taken some time for the young people to engage within that meeting. I think on times we found it really useful. It does sort of help sort of problem solve, which is I think it's a good forum to do that. It doesn't work every time, and some things aren't maybe not appropriate for that setting, but in general, it's improving with us and going well.
Well, I'm pleased to hear it, Rob. I mean, the main thing is, you know, to persevere and to give yourself and your staff team time, because if it's a relatively new thing, then I guess the skills that you're developing within the community also take time for you all to develop. And eventually you might find that you end up with 2 or 3 people in your community that are brilliant at groups and really begin to take that area of the work forward and enjoy it and thrive on it. And then there'll be people that will really be able to help you to sort of, you know, hold on to the importance of group work. But in the early stages, you know, it is hard work. It's incredibly hard work because there's no way to protect yourself in a group, is there, as a staff team? You know, you are very much available to the young people. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I mean, I don't know, Paige and Katie, we got until about past, is that right? Yeah, okay, because there's a bit more time. So look, I mean, what I want to do is to suggest is that we put you into some small groups so that you can have a bit of an opportunity to talk about some of the things that have come up, some of the questions or the ideas that have come up in the presentation. But and that's one thing you can do. But the other thing I'd like you to do more particularly is think about what you think are the skills you need to work in a group setting, to be a group worker. And I'm not just thinking about the community as a whole, because that is a group setting, but I'm thinking about working in a group. So you might have a community meeting, or you may have a therapeutic group. What are the skills that you think you need as an individual to manage that process? Of course, you're all going to be working in different communities, but I hope that will bring out some contrast and some interesting connections between you. So if we give you